Now let's look at the people. So the reason we've set the book up this way is I really like these character studies, and I keep saying to make these part of your quiet time, to take a week or 2 weeks or whatever it may take, and take the life of David and study it. And don't do kind of your inductive Bible study where you're looking for observations, interpretations. Maybe take a break from that and just ask certain questions. What do I learn about trusting Yahweh? What do I learn about integrity? What do I learn about courage? And ask these questions and maybe read the story of David or the story of Saul or the story of Samuel, or pick the character, the story of Ruth, and ask, what is this trying to teach me about living a wise life in response to Yahweh and His faithfulness, trusting Him and obeying Him? So, with that in mind, let's look at the people. We've covered a lot of the material already. So once again, I said at the beginning, we're going to work our way through all of these books 3 different times. So the books, the plot, now the people. On page 109, we see Samuel. Now, Samuel, if we're thinking about Samuel in modern day language or politics, Samuel functions almost like a really prominent political figure, almost like the Speaker of the House. He is very prominent. He's very important. He's also a religious, priestly leader. And so he's got a lot of authority and power. And let's see how that story has unfolded for him. Notice his character on page 110. We're going to see him praying. He doesn't seem to make moves without stopping and praying to Yahweh. That's a great model for you and for me. He's always concerned, Lord, let me come to you first. Direct me. He seems to always want to let Yahweh lead. He's a man of distinction. He grows in, notice the note, he grows in both stature and favor with Yahweh and also with people. He has an integrity that leads to distinction. We're going to see, by the way, the gospel writer Luke is intentionally trying to get our minds to think about Samuel when he makes this statement about Jesus. Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and men. Remember, Samuel is a prophet, a priest, and a king. And for the gospel writer Luke to draw our attention to that, he's trying to say, look, this is the prophet, priest, and king that we really need, which is just awesome. The biblical authors are so interesting, and these stories are crafted so well, they're written so well, and so we want to pick up on that, and that's one of the reasons why we're doing Panorama. Now, notice his integrity. He's a man of prayer, distinction. He's a man of integrity, especially in comparison to those worthless sons who were taking advantage of the women coming to the tabernacle. Notice it. When you compare Eli's sons in this long paragraph to verse 26, Samuel's growing in favor, in integrity, and Eli's sons are literally the worst. And so this contrast is drawn. We're supposed to see it as we read the narrative. But notice what we're calling, he's a man of failed legacy. This hurts me to see. This is tragic. To see this note, I think it catches our attention. Like mentor becomes the mentee, or we might often say, like the parent goes the child. Eli personally discipled Samuel. Samuel grows up having the priest of Yahweh as his discipler. But notice, Eli failed to pass on the legacy to his own children, and Samuel will have that same failure. It doesn't give us indication, was he a workaholic? Did he sacrifice his family for his ministry? It doesn't say that. We don't know exactly the reason, but we know that there's often a generational miss that is passed, this legacy of obedience to Yahweh, or oftentimes a legacy of disobedience. And oftentimes there's these little things that we learn from the people that train us, that we learn from watching the people that disciple us, that gets passed into the people that we train and we disciple. And we want to be cognizant of that. It almost makes you wish Samuel had stopped at some point when his children were growing up and said, wait a sec, the same thing that Eli had with his kids, I'm starting to see that with my kids. Let me pause and hit time out, and I need to assess, where's that thing that I was trained in, that miss that I was trained in, that I'm passing on to them? And we see that failed legacy. Now, as we continue, we have to ask the question, because they're going to demand a king. Was Israel supposed to have a king? It's a key theological question. Remember, when God constitutes the people of Israel at Mount Sinai, He says, you will be a kingdom of priests for me. You will be a set apart or holy nation. And it seems as if God will be their king. You don't need a king, because God is the one who will fight your battles. God is the one who will lead you. And yet, God had been giving little hints along the way that one day this this true king would rise. One day, this one whom the scepter will not depart from. Remember, all the way back in Genesis, we see the scepter will not depart from Judah. We had seen in the story of Abraham, look on page 111, God had said to Abraham, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings will come from you. He said to Jacob, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. We saw in Genesis 49, verse 10, the scepter will not depart from Judah until the third person masculine singular, he to whom it belongs, shall come. God keeps giving these hints, and the biggest hint we get is obviously in Deuteronomy chapter 17. This is one of my favorite verses in all of the Bible. I love this verse, and so I'm going to draw our attention to it because it's part of our key theological question. Was Israel supposed to have a king? It seems as if the answer is yes, but what kind of king is the key question. And look, when God's speaking through Moses, remember on the plains of Moab, the second sermon called Deuteronomy is given to the next generation of Israel as they go into the land. In Deuteronomy 17, Moses had said this, when you come to the land that Yahweh your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then when you say, hey, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, God is predicting this moment. It says, you may indeed set a king over you, but it needs to be one whom the Lord your God will choose. It needs to be one from among your brothers who you will set as king. Now, don't put a foreigner. Why? Because a foreigner will no doubt have all these foreign gods that he will worship, and he'll turn the people's hearts away. We don't do that. Now, I'm going to have you draw some things or annotate some things if you're using a PDF. Write some things down here. Only, what kind of king do I want? Only, I want you to underline, he must not, put a number 1. He must not, then number 1, acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to go to Egypt to acquire many horses. And write down in the margin outside that, I want you to write military power. He doesn't need to acquire military power. Now we continue. Look down at verse 17. Underline it. He shall not acquire, and put a number 2, many wives for himself. And I want you to write in the margin next to that, he does not need political power. Now we got to understand this whole thing with the wives. In the ancient culture, why did the kings often take all these extra, sometimes even hundreds of wives? And it's not because they just really love sex and they want to have lots and lots of sex and lots of relationships. The purpose of acquiring many wives in the ancient culture was this. When you acquire a wife or a concubine and then produce children with them from a foreign power, it is essentially making a political alliance with that foreign ruler. You would take that king's daughters and then marry them and have children with them. The reason you do is that king now won't want to come and invade your land and kill your people because he'll now be killing his own grandchildren. And so it's a political alliance. It's a way to gain favor with other nations by marrying their daughters off to you. You produce children through them, and now that king's grandkids are your kids, and he won't want to come and kill you. That's the reason you have many wives. So the Israelite king doesn't need military power, number 1, and he doesn't need political power. All these alliances, number 2. Third thing, into verse 17, nor shall he, underline it, number 3, acquire excessive silver and gold. And just write in the margin, economic power. Military power, political power, economic power. Imagine it. That is what is being told to the Israelite kings. You can have a king, but by the way, he doesn't need to be like any of the other kings of the other nations. Military power, political power, and economic power is how every single king in the history of our planet has made themselves powerful. It's how they gain control. Military, political, and economic power. And Yahweh says, you can have a king, but not like that. And it's not printed here, but what the very next line is, it says this, what shall he do? He doesn't need those 3 things. What shall he do? Well, it says he shall write for himself a copy of the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, in the presence of the priests so that there's no errors, and then read from it every single day that he is king over Israel. Think about what this is saying. You may have a leader, but that leader, what I care about, God says, is his heart for me, his trust and obedience for me. And I just have always thought that would be amazing if we could have our elected officials in America. And I recognize that we're not a Christian nation, so this is a little different than Israel. But wouldn't it be awesome if we had the elected officials? Imagine a nation where your elected officials are writing and then reading their own copy of the trust book called the Torah every single day of their reign, and they're forsaking political, military, and economic power because Yahweh is their God and they trust in Him. That would be amazing. But what do the people do? They say, no, no, no. We want a king like all the other nations, one who will acquire all those different powers and fight our battles for us. Turn to page 112. They say, then we will be like the other nations, which a king who will fight for us, who will lead us. And it's a tragic note. We see the box, the reflection on page 112. A king was intended, one who was God's choice and in God's timing. The selection of Saul may have been allowed, but was perhaps premature. And we might, the narrative has you think, and we're asking you to think, what do you think about this? And we're going to see, I think the narrative is pretty obvious. The result is this disaster called the reign of Saul. And now we'll turn and look at Saul's life.